The world woke on June 22, 2025, to news of a dramatic escalation in the Middle East. The United States military had conducted a series of powerful airstrikes against key Iranian nuclear facilities. The operation, codenamed Operation Midnight Hammer, was a swift and decisive action ordered by President Donald Trump. It marked a significant turning point in the long-standing tensions between Washington and Tehran. The primary targets were three of the most critical centers of Iran's nuclear program: the heavily fortified Fordow fuel enrichment plant, the sprawling Natanz enrichment facility, and the Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center. These sites have long been a source of international concern, believed to be central to Iran's ambitions to develop nuclear capabilities. The strikes were precise and targeted, aiming to cripple the infrastructure without causing a wider catastrophe. The operation utilized some of the most advanced and powerful conventional weapons in the U.S. arsenal. B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, flying undetected through Iranian airspace, were tasked with delivering the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, or MOPs. These colossal 30,000-pound bombs, often called bunker busters, were used for the first time in combat to penetrate the deeply buried facilities at Fordow and Natanz. The goal was to destroy targets located far underground, beyond the reach of most conventional munitions. In addition to the aerial assault, U.S. submarines positioned in the region launched a volley of Tomahawk cruise missiles, which provided further surgical strikes against the Natanz and Isfahan sites, targeting specific buildings and workshops. Following the attack, President Trump addressed the world, declaring the mission a spectacular military success. He stated that the targeted nuclear sites were completely and totally obliterated, a claim supported by initial battle damage assessments from the Pentagon. These early reports indicated that the strikes had inflicted extremely severe damage and destruction upon the facilities. U.S. and Israeli intelligence officials have estimated that the operation has successfully set back Iran's nuclear program by a significant margin, potentially by as much as 2 to 3 years. This delay, they argue, provides a critical window for diplomatic efforts and prevents an immediate nuclear threat from emerging in the region. A crucial aspect of this operation was the effort to avoid a nuclear catastrophe. Despite the immense power of the weapons used, there was no nuclear explosion or nuke blast. This is because the attack involved conventional, not nuclear warheads. The primary concern for many in the region and around the world was the potential release of dangerous radioactive material. However, international and regional monitoring agencies quickly moved to assess the situation. Their findings have been reassuring, confirming that the strikes did not result in any significant release of hazardous substances into the environment. This careful planning was vital to containing the immediate impact of the military action. The American military action did not occur in a vacuum, but was the culmination of escalating hostilities between Iran and Israel. The direct conflict between the two regional powers had erupted just 9 days earlier, on June 13, 2025. This war marked a new and dangerous phase in their long-running shadow conflict, which had previously been waged through proxy forces, cyber attacks, and targeted assassinations. Israel initiated its campaign with the stated goal of dismantling Iran's nuclear program, which it views as an existential threat. The United States, a key ally of Israel, had initially exhausted diplomatic channels in an attempt to de-escalate the situation, but these efforts ultimately failed to halt the rapidly intensifying conflict. The U.S. decision to intervene directly was framed as a necessary step to support its ally and neutralize a pressing threat to regional and global security. The White House stated that the strikes were a limited defensive measure aimed solely at Iran's nuclear infrastructure, not at its government or people. President Trump communicated to Tehran that the U.S. does not seek regime change, but will not tolerate the pursuit of nuclear weapons by Iran. This message was intended to draw a clear line, defining the scope of the military action while warning against any form of retaliation. The intervention underscored the deep security partnership between the United States and Israel and their shared objective of preventing a nuclear-armed Iran. The background to this conflict is complex, rooted in decades of animosity following Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution. Tensions have steadily mounted over Iran's nuclear enrichment activities, its development of ballistic missiles, and its support for militant groups across the Middle East, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. Israel, in turn, has been accused of conducting covert operations against Iranian nuclear scientists and facilities. The recent war was the point at which these simmering tensions boiled over into open warfare, drawing in the world's foremost military power and fundamentally altering the strategic landscape of the entire region. A key concern for the United States was the potential for the conflict to spiral out of control, disrupting global energy supplies and destabilizing an already volatile region. The primary justification for Operation Midnight Hammer was to preemptively remove what U.S. officials described as Iran's most dangerous capability. By degrading the nuclear program, the administration argued it was reducing the stakes of the conflict and creating space for a potential off-ramp. However, this direct intervention also carried immense risks, placing U.S. forces in the region in the direct line of fire and raising the prospect of a much wider, more devastating war that could engulf neighboring countries. In the immediate aftermath of the strikes, the most pressing concern for the international community was the risk of radioactive contamination. Fortunately, these fears were quickly allayed by official reports. The International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, the United Nations nuclear watchdog, issued a statement confirming that its monitoring stations had detected no increase in off-site radiation levels. This was echoed by Saudi Arabia's nuclear regulatory body, which also reported that no radioactive effects had been detected in the Persian Gulf region. The IAEA did confirm that its inspectors had noted damage to a centrifuge assembly workshop in Isfahan, but importantly, there was no reported leakage of any hazardous materials from the site. Another critical outcome of the operation was the lack of direct casualties at the targeted nuclear facilities. According to reports, Iranian authorities, likely anticipating an attack, had evacuated personnel from the Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan sites before the U.S. missiles and bombs arrived. This preventative measure successfully avoided loss of life among the workers and scientists at these locations. However, it is important to note that the broader conflict has not been without a human cost. Iran's health minister has reported that prior Israeli strikes in the preceding days of the war had already resulted in at least 430 deaths and over 3,000 injuries across the country. The Iranian response to the American strikes was swift and defiant. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and leaders of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps vehemently condemned the attack, labeling it an act of brutal military aggression and a violation of national sovereignty. They vowed that there would be significant retaliation, specifically threatening U.S. military forces stationed throughout the Middle East. Furthermore, Iranian officials raised the possibility of closing the Strait of Hormuz, a critical choke point for global oil shipments. Despite the damage to its facilities, Tehran insisted that it would not abandon its nuclear program and would rebuild what was destroyed. The international reaction to the U.S. operation was sharply divided, reflecting existing geopolitical alliances. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu publicly praised the action, thanking President Trump for his decisive support in confronting a common threat. Conversely, Russia and China condemned the strikes as a flagrant violation of international law and a dangerous provocation that could lead to uncontrollable escalation. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres urgently called for restraint and de-escalation from all parties. Within the United States, the reaction was split along party lines, with most Republicans supporting the president's decision, while many Democrats criticized the lack of congressional authorization for the use of military force. With the immediate aftermath of the strikes now clear, the world holds its breath to see what happens next. The situation remains incredibly tense, with the ball now in Iran's court. President Trump has issued a stark warning, stating that any retaliation from Tehran will be met with force far greater than what was witnessed tonight. This leaves Iran with a difficult choice: retaliate and risk a devastating all-out war with the United States, or show restraint and potentially appear weak on the domestic and international stage. The coming days and weeks will be critical in determining whether this event marks the beginning of a larger regional conflict or a turning point toward a new, albeit fragile, status quo. The potential for Iranian retaliation is significant and could take many forms. The most immediate threat is to U.S. troops and bases in countries like Iraq, Syria, and across the Persian Gulf. Iran could also leverage its proxy forces to launch attacks on Israeli and American interests. The threat to close the Strait of Hormuz, if acted upon, would have severe consequences for the global economy by choking off a substantial portion of the world's oil supply. Any of these actions would almost certainly trigger a powerful American military response, creating a dangerous cycle of escalation that would be difficult for either side to control. This event is profoundly important because it represents a major shift in the rules of engagement in the Middle East. The first-ever combat use of the massive ordnance penetrator against a sovereign nation's nuclear sites establishes a new and aggressive precedent. It demonstrates a willingness by the United States to use overwhelming conventional force to prevent nuclear proliferation, even at the risk of starting a major war. This action will undoubtedly shape the strategic calculations of other nations, both those with nuclear ambitions and those allied with the United States. It underscores the fragility of international norms and the growing preference for unilateral military action over multilateral diplomacy in moments of crisis. ultimately, the long-term consequences of Operation Midnight Hammer are yet to be seen. While the strikes may have delayed Iran's nuclear program, they have also likely hardened the resolve of its leadership to pursue such weapons as an ultimate deterrent against future attacks. The path forward is fraught with peril. The international community, particularly the United Nations and other major powers, will face immense pressure to broker a ceasefire and bring all parties back to the negotiating table. The choices made in the coming weeks will not only determine the future of Iran and its relationship with the world, but will also have lasting implications for peace and security across the entire globe.